Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to have a look at one of the more interesting facets of chaos. Its ability to contradict its very own apparent nature, yet remain entirely a thing of the warp. Disciplined yet ferocious, calculating yet zealous, organized yet chaotic. The Blood Pact of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. But first, it is that time of year again, the one where you have to find a Christmas gift for the father who has literally everything. The one who answers any question of, "Hey Dad, what do you want for Christmas?" with a straight-faced, "Another Mercedes." And whilst that might be a bit out of reach for most of us, you can offer him the Mercedes of the male hygiene world, a Manscaped performance package. Which comes, of course, with the Weed Whacker, for all of those bushy places, the Lawnmower 4.0, with a handy-dandy light to see where you're going, and of course, as always, my favourites, the Ball Creams, the Crop Reviver, and the Crop Preserver. You'll also get some free gifts along with it, like the Shed travel bag to store your ball cream in, and a pair of premium boxer shorts. So check out my link in the description down below now, and use my code ARCH20 for 20% off the purchase and free shipping. Now, on to the lore. It's a festive ad, considering the topic at hand, isn't it? And there's a bit of tragedy involved here too. See, I would love for this to basically be the Deathcore of Krieg video, the lead into a much larger endeavor, because the Sabbat World Crusade is a really cool conflict, and obviously the set for the highly popular, and rightly so, Gaunt's Ghost series. It's even received a very good fluff book as well, called the Sabbat World Crusades, which is a rarity in this day and age where GW just doesn't put out fluff books anymore, much less actual campaign books like in the glory days of Imperial armor. By all rights, this should be the lead-in to another big series. Another Vrax, another Badab, and that was the plan as well. I was going to do the raid on Castrol Nova this year and the Sabbat Worlds Crusade next year, but GW is simply no longer a company that is worthy of that level of effort and quality. Not to toot my own horn too much here, but I put a lot of effort into those series. They've got thousands of dollars of custom-made assets, both in terms of art to tell the story, and in tailor-made music to convey the atmosphere. And what I could do now is so much more than that. Here, let me give you a sneak peek at an animation I've had made for an upcoming project, which, well, the theme of which is hardly going to be too difficult to detect. The quality of stuff I am able to make now is kind of incomparable to both Vrax and Badab. And the 40k universe absolutely does deserve that level of quality. But GW does not. And it is very damn difficult to want to add extra value to the company that threatened to sue the entirety of the content creating sphere of Warhammer YouTube just because they didn't like me. But enough complaining. I didn't start this video to whine at you, but I figured it was important to lead in with this, because frankly, this should be the start of a series on the Sabbat World Crusades. But instead, we shall have to content ourselves with a look at the Blood Pact of the Gaur. The origins of this highly unusual Cornet warrior brotherhood can be traced back several thousand years to a small, barbaric, isolated world at the very edges of the Sabbat sector. This planet, Gura, was a feral one, ruled over by rivaling bands of low-tech warlords, fighting one another for dominance over that hill or that plain or that tiny rural settlement. A history not at all that uncommon in the wide reaches of the galaxy. A world at peace would be far, far more unusual, and the people of Gaur were not initially chaos cultists, but one of the countless factions that were fighting for dominance over this particular ball of dirt hurtling through the cosmos were led by a man with the title of Gaur. He was the leader of a local priesthood who worshipped the god of battle, the god of slaughter, and the god of blood. I doubt it'll come as much of a surprise when I tell you that this was also a very martial brotherhood, and initially was a small elite clique gathered around the Gaur who acted as his private enforcers, his bodyguards, and undoubtedly his elite strike force on the battlefield, and personal policing force as well. As slowly but surely, the Gaur's influence grew from that of merely one of many local warlords to the dominant force on the planet of Gaur. The history of the Gaur's ascension is unknown. We don't even know how long it took him to achieve dominance over his planet, but we do know that eventually the Gaurans developed spaceflight, which indicates to us that the Gaur and his cornet brethren were clearly not in complete control of society, as, well, cornet cultists tend to not be the most, scientifically inclined lot. And as they eventually managed to develop stable spaceflight, they must have had some far more forward-thinking elements of their society still at large. Alternatively, it is also possible that they were picked up by somebody else, or that they somehow managed to capture a spaceship that had carelessly landed on their planet. Whichever way it happened, the Gaur and his Blood Pact made it off-world, and quickly established themselves amongst the many other space-faring factions of this part of the Sabbat Worlds. Indeed, his influence grew to the point where the Blood Pact became recognized as far more than a priesthood of an insular backwaters world. Instead, it became more of a professional military force. It became something almost akin to the feudal knights of old Earth, where it was a sign of nobility and privilege and special honor to be inducted into the Blood Pact. And this was not an honor or a privilege granted to just anyone. The Gaur personally inducts every single solitary member of the Blood Pact through an ancient ritual where they swear their obedience to the Gaur in person and then cut open the palms of their hands on his ritualistically sharpened armor. Only thus can someone become a member of the Blood Pact. This in turn meant that the Blood Pact was able to maintain its elite status long after having grown far, far beyond the meager limits of a backwater priesthood. Since each and every member was specifically selected on the merit of their actions and capabilities, the Blood Pact turned into an army of elites that married the ferocity of a cornet cult with the disciplined order of a modern military force, making them, of course, also a remarkable exception to the usual norms of cornet cults. Now, of course, Khorne himself cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it does. He has no rules of engagement, he has no organizational structure. There is therefore nothing to say that a cold and calculating general cannot be as faithful a follower as Khorne as a blood-slavering berserker. But of course, that whole rage of corn thing does tend to mean that the latter is far more common than the former. And to make it clear as well, it is not that the Blood Pact are free from the rage of corn, not at all. It is merely that they bind that rage with something even stronger: fear of one's superiors. The Gaur and his lieutenants, his officers and commanders have developed a system to shackle that rage, to direct and to control it, to enslave it, really. For in my view, the Blood Pact is not necessarily a disciplined force. That is the wrong term. It is a bound force. They do not control their cornet rage through order, or again through discipline. They control it through fear. They control it through a pack mentality, where the leaders know better how to make the blood flow. For if God truly does not care from whence the blood flows, then surely the greater the quantity, the better. And if the Blood Pact can slay more worshippers of the false corpse emperor through a disciplined volley than a berserk charge into heavy machine guns, then that is what the Blood Pact will do. And so in a sense, the Blood Pact, for all of their disregard for the usual trappings of cornet worship, may actually be some of Khorne's most faithful, and certainly amongst his most effective servants. And incidentally, I want to expand upon this theory just a little bit here, because one of the things that is often repeated about the Blood Pact is that they are modelled on the style of an Imperial Guard regiment. And in terms of equipment, that is absolutely true, in that they like to steal Imperial Guard equipment, they like to loot it, and they like to try and copy it. Though again, the limited technological and engineering expertise of Chaos followers tend to limit the success of any copying efforts. Of course, their kit also tends to lean a bit more heavily in the direction of melee combat, utilizing large and ferocious-looking combat blades or even straight-up swords. But whilst there are equipment similarities, I do not believe that they base their way of fighting off the Imperial Guard. I think my idea of the pack mentality is far more correct, because the Blood Pact was the Blood Pact long before they encountered the Imperial Guard. They were the Blood Pact fighting in an organized, disciplined manner all the way back to the earliest days of their home planet of Gura. Their rituals and their styles are theirs, not those of the Imperial Guard. Now surely they will have picked up things here and there, things like fire discipline, like volley fire, or perhaps a better system for organizing their officers and commanders. But it would be a mistake to say that they are merely copies of the Imperial Guard. They are instead an organically cornate version of the Guard. Because it could not be otherwise. They could not possibly have copied something they did not know existed until they left their home world, until they joined with other Chaos warbands raiding the sanguinary worlds. And even then, they would have been fighting primarily PDF and local guard forces, a far cry from the truly professional elements of the God Emperor's military. For we must remember that, to begin with, the Blood Pact and the many other Chaos warbands plaguing the edges of the Sabbat Worlds were just that, mere irritants, raiders and bandits. The part of the Sabbat Worlds they inhabited were known as the Sanguinary Worlds, and they were considered a bit of problematic area, a modern-day no-go zone on a galactic scale, but it was not until the eventual rise of Nad-Zibar, the first Archon, that they grew into a real, consorted and consolidated military threat. And in his great Chaos army, the Blood Pact was but one small component part. Probably amongst the smaller of them all, though also one with powers far beyond their numbers due to their elite stature. It was this coalition of Chaos warbands, warlords, raiders, and zealots that eventually conquered much of the Sabbat Worlds, who had themselves only been colonized by the Imperium a few thousand years previously, the blink of an eye in the Imperium's long and storied history. And it was also Nadsibar that led the initial resistance against the Imperial Crusade launched to retake the Sabbat Worlds. However, Nadsibar eventually fell in combat with the Imperial Warmaster Slado. This came as the culmination of a near 10-year-long campaign, as the Archon had kept the Imperial Crusade at near complete check for the last decade, which had come as an enormous shock to the Imperials, as they had expected a Crusade-sized force to simply sweep into the Sabbat Worlds and clean it out of what they thought were poorly organized rebel militias, with only occasional examples of fully fledged Chaos cults. Instead, the Crusade and Warmaster Slado had to engage in a decade-long battle of wits against the Archon, which eventually culminated in the battle for Balhaut, where the Archon was slain, but in the process, Warmaster Slado also had to give his own life. This, however, was the break that the Crusade had been looking for. The Imperial Guard was a professional organized military, and Slado had already anointed his successor, and so the war machine could continue apace with very little real delay as Warmaster Makaroth took up the wreath of conquest and pushed the Crusade deeper into the Sabbat Worlds with a ferocity rarely displayed by his predecessor, as Makaroth was eager to finish the campaign whilst the Chaos forces were in a state of disarray, because unlike the Imperial Guard, successions within Chaos alliances are never an easy matter. And thus, limited only by the speed at which the news of the Archon's death could travel, the Chaos warbands, cults and factions led by a variety of magisters, priests, and officers all turned on one another to decide who would be the next Archon. And there were many contenders: Shebol Red Hand, Heritor Asphodel, Inokai Inokenti, all Chaos war leaders of massive repute and power, both material and immaterial. But the leading candidate to succeed the fallen Archon was Anakwanar Sek, one of his most brilliant field leaders, and an expert in psychological warfare. Undoubtedly, a lot of the credit for the original Chaos conquest of the Sabbat Worlds must be laid at his feet, and the disinformation campaign that led the Imperium to believe that this massive Chaos organized uprising was a simple provincial revolt sounds like something he might be able to pull off as well. But it would not be Anakwanar Sek who emerged victorious from the long and extraordinarily bloody civil war fought in the Chaos ranks to anoint their new leader, as Chaos, of course, engaged in the diplomatic process as it always does, with knives and meat cleavers. It is even said in the Gaunt's Ghost books that Imperial intelligence speculated that more Chaos warriors died electing the new Archon than died at the hands of the Imperial forces. And knowing Chaos, I can believe it. But who then would be the new Archon? Who could possibly outwit the master of grand strategy, Anakwanar Sek? Well, it was someone completely unexpected. A backwater warlord who possessed only a relatively small band of followers, particularly in an alliance that measured its war-fighting strength in the billions. The unexpected leader was, of course, Gaur. With his name, of course, being Urlok, and his title being Gaur of the Blood Pact, and now Archon of the Chaos Alliance. He swiftly proved himself to be a worthy leader as well. Makaroth had been pushing deeper into Chaos-controlled territory as quickly as he could to take maximum advantage of the election process that his enemies were currently undergoing. But doing so, he had also left several exposed flanks and salients in the Crusade hosts, something that Gaur was swift to exploit. Because he had something that none of the other Chaos Warlords had. He had the reason for his ascension to the post of Archon. He had a disciplined and organized army accustomed to and expected to obey orders immediately, with precision and determination. He was able to launch lightning raids against his opponent magisters. He was able to destroy their armies, seize their planets, and put them all in positions of checkmate where the only choice was to submit or die. And he now turned that talent upon the Imperium, placing the entire Crusade in dire jeopardy of having its flanks turned and rolled up entirely, which forced Makaroth to cancel his mad dash forward to victory and turn instead to simple survival. The Gaur had turned a losing situation into, at the very least, a stalemate, and in areas there were dangerous suggestions that the Chaos forces were gaining ground to the point where their momentum might no longer be stopped. And the weakness of the Crusade host fed the Gaur and the Blood Pact. Not only had they now won the Chaos Civil War, they had also demonstrated that they could fight the Imperial Guard on an equal footing. They could turn their advance into a retreat, and they could defeat them in the open field. This brought incredible numbers of fresh recruits flooding to the Gaur's banner, who I imagine was very busy carrying out the induction rituals, as soon his army grew to nearly 1 million men. 1 million elite troopers, at the very least equivalent to Imperial Guard formations, now poised to strike at the very heart of the Crusade. And all of this was, of course, achieved, yet again, due to the strength of the Blood Pact. And so, let us now talk about why exactly it is that the Blood Pact is such a lethal fighting force. Beginning, of course, with their most obvious and distinct deviation from the standard structure and tactics of a Chaos cult. Namely, that the Blood Pact warriors are soldiers rather than simple fanatics. Oh, they are absolutely still fanatical in their devotion to Khorne, but they are more Knights Templar than screaming flagellant. They fight because it is for Khorne, and because Khorne wishes it, but they do not allow their religion to override their better battlefield judgment. This in turn means that the Blood Pact can be wielded like an actual army. Individual units can be given individual tasks. Individual soldiers can be given their own specializations. The Blood Pact has heavy weapons teams. They have autocannons. They have bolters. They have las cannons. They have sniper teams, recon specialists, demolition experts, and fine line officers at every level. They even have a substantial degree of independence amongst the regular soldiers, allowing each and every single Blood Pact member to pursue their objectives even without the direct guidance of their leaders. And there's a key word as well: objective. The Blood Pact can carry out objectives. They can attack specific areas of the front line. They can try and surround Imperial Guard forces. They can carry out logistical strikes. They can attack command structure elements, and they can set up ambushes and wait until the moment where the attack will have the absolute most devastating effect. In fact, one of the most famous Blood Pact victories was just such an action, where a little over a company's worth of Blood Pact troops lay completely dead still in the desert under the scorching sun for 3 days without moving and without revealing their positions, because they were waiting in the path of an Imperial retreat, where over a regiment's worth of Imperial soldiers were pulling back straight through the ambush area. Over the course of less than half an hour, 3,000 Imperial Guard soldiers were cut to pieces by 200 Blood Pact. No Chaos cult could ever replicate that. Hell, most Imperial Guard regiments couldn't do what the Blood Pact did over the course of those 3 days. As even as when their comrades literally died from exposure right next to them, the rest of the soldiers simply kept their faces to the ground, lying there, waiting and waiting and waiting for their commanders to give the order to fire. Discipline, inspired by religious convictions, can be a frightening weapon indeed. But it is more than just their training and their expertise that makes them so lethal. It is also their weapons and their variety of weapons and the ways in which they use them. I've already mentioned that the Blood Pact has specialists, something that very few Chaos cultist warbands have. Many of these specialists were ex-Imperial Guard fighters, who are dispersed throughout the various Blood Pact formations to instruct the other soldiers on the usage of explosives, of precision rifles like long lasers, or the usage of mortars and heavy infantry weapons. It is the utilization of these things that makes them even more dangerous. Again, a Chaos cult might simply stand up and charge at the enemy, screaming their lungs out whilst being cut down by machine gun fire. The Blood Pact will set up their own machine guns to suppress the enemies, allowing them to sneak forward slowly but surely under a protective hail of heavy bolter rounds. Even more importantly is also the fact that this support is entirely organic, due to the Blood Pact's excellent communication systems. Officers on the front line, squad leaders, and even individual soldiers can communicate with those weapon teams to inform them of where support is needed, where specialists like flamethrowers are required, and they can report in on enemy formations and movements, allowing other heavy weapons like mortars or even rear-line artillery batteries to get in on the fight as well. And there's another point too. The Blood Pact is a combined arms force. They fight alongside tanks, alongside artillery, alongside even other Chaos forces, though they tend to use them more like chaff than actual allies. And they even have some super heavy tanks in their arsenal. The Sabbat Worlds were always considered a bit of a backwater, and so were not over-blessed with equipment, but it did contain several forge worlds of older patterns, allowing the Blood Pact access to lesser variants of Imperial armor, like the AT-70 Reaver or the Steg 4, and a handful, as mentioned, of ancient Baneblade super heavy tanks. And the Blood Pact is also able to wield combined arms that the Imperial Guard is at best extraordinarily hesitant to do. The Imperial Guard does have sanctioned psychers, you see, but they are treated with a great deal of distrust, whereas the Blood Pact are more than happy to wield their own psychers, so-called Gaur mages, as offensive weaponry, and have even developed spells unique to them to enhance the potential of Blood Pact warriors, or to curse the enemy, amongst other things by inspiring a deep fear in them, a fear of death and of blood, probably a focusing effect of the Blood Pact soldiers themselves. As we all know how the warp works at this point, it takes what you think is real and it makes it real. Just like the orcs are able to guide their own collective consciousness, it would not surprise me at all to learn the Gaur mages were able to take many of the more grisly parts of the Blood Pact and amplify their effects. For the Blood Pact soldiers are a terrifying looking lot. Starting with their iron grotesques, grinning, sharp-toothed masks with viciously hooked nose that every soldier carries, usually made out of either polished silver or dark iron, whilst many officers wear once in more precious metals like silver or gold or platinum. The rest of their armour is, of course, equally chaotic, flak armour being festooned with spikes and sharp edges in imitation of their beloved Gaur. Their uniforms, too, which at first appear to be a simple deep red, is far more malicious than a mere colour choice, as all Blood Pact uniforms are not actually coloured at all. They are whatever shade they were originally created in, or whatever colour worn by the Imperial Guardsmen they stole the uniform of. They are simply dunked and stained in so much blood through washing rituals that the Vita has now seeped into the very fabric, turning it a deep arterial red. Another striking detail to notice too are the deep scars all over the Blood Pact trooper, specifically on his hands, which are always kept bare regardless of the environment, as it shows off his scarring. The deeper, the more vicious, the more malformed and poorly healed the scar, the better, as they are marks of honour and devotion. Remember, again, every Blood Pact trooper cuts his hands open on the sharp edges of the Gaur's armour. A deeper cut means a deeper loyalty and a deeper bond. Yet another aspect that makes the Blood Pact so horrifying is that they are not a static entity. They are not, again, a ritualistic warband. They are not locked in their ways. They don't wage war this way because it is the way they have always done it. They wage war this way because it is effective, and will happily adopt to changing circumstances or new and interesting doctrines or weaponry. They are more than happy to integrate the various tanks I mentioned earlier into their formations, to work in psychers and artillery, and even cooperating with Chaos Space Marines and other cultist groups. They are also more than happy to take new lessons from the Imperial Guard, which is why they will actively try to capture Imperial officers and either try to turn them so that they can become new Blood Pact members, or to pump them for information. There were even those who, seeing the success of the Blood Pact, tried to replicate them with various degrees of success. One of the better attempts, for example, would be the Sons of Sek, which we'll cover some other time. Oh god, I am so tempted to just start doing Sabbat Worlds lore now. Maybe next week. We'll see. There are so many cool things about the Sabbat Worlds, but we'll see, for the reasons in the beginning of the video. This in turn means that the Blood Pact will learn from its mistakes. A Chaos Warhost will always charge at you haphazardly. Best case scenario, they might try something semi-fancy like terror tactics, or the occasional flanking maneuver, or the integration of Chaos Space Marines or demons, stuff like that. But by and large, a Chaos War band's efforts, its actions, are usually very predictable. But with the Blood Pact, you never know what you're going to get. You know you're going to be up against determined and well-trained fighters, led by competent officers, but how they are going to be employed is anybody's guess. They could carry out a major armoured escalade. They could launch full-scale tank pushers. They could simply grind their enemies into the dirt with massed artillery, or they could carry out infiltration missions in the middle of the night. They could settle down to carry out trench warfare. They can do sieges. They can do wars of maneuver. They can meet and counter the Imperial Guard on any battlefield in any form of warfare that they choose to engage in. And many times, frighteningly enough, they're even better than the Guard at these things, which is the reason why they've emerged victorious so frighteningly often. If the Blood Pact could be said to have any weakness at all, it is their standards. As each and every single Blood Pact trooper is de facto hand-picked and must be inducted by the Gaur personally, their numbers, relatively speaking, are fairly small. 1,000,000-odd fighting men might sound like a lot, but in the scale of a Crusade-level war, that is not a whole lot at all, and often leave the Blood Pact having to rely on less than desirable partner forces to protect their flanks or rears. They also often have to rely on the logistical support of these other troops, as the Blood Pact will obviously have their own logistical support, as they use mostly their own types of Imperial Guard-style weapons, rather than the far cruder armament given to the cultists. But still, they do need to rely on the production of their worlds. They need to rely on ships to bring them these weapons, ships very rarely, if ever, actually occupied and piloted by the Blood Pact, as every single Blood Pact soldier forced to the rear line to make sure that weapon and ammunition arrive at the front is one less of an already fairly small number of elite fighters. Their rate of recruitment, too, remains low. Despite the massive increase in potential numbers, again, only about 1,000,000 were actually in the Blood Pact, despite the billions of potential recruits in the total of the Sabbat Worlds. This, therefore, leaves the Blood Pact very vulnerable to attrition, and perhaps even more so vulnerable to their allies, rather than their friends, because the aforementioned Sons of Sek were of course created by Anakwanar Sek, the Gaur's main competitor for the title of Archon, a title he only gained because he had an army and Sek used to have nothing more than cultists. But as Sek is not your average Chaos Warlord, he, too, is able to learn from his mistakes. The Gaur is going to have to watch his back against old friends, as much as he's going to have to watch the front line for the Imperials. But such is the lot of any successful Chaos Commander, I do suppose. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.